I remember when I was growing up, there was an advertising campaign, Milk, it does a body good. I think a lot of people would be surprised that it's not so good for the environment. I wonder if we could start there. Why is big dairy a danger to the planet?
Well, big dairy, and first of all, right now, the vast majority of our milk and dairy products comes from very, very large dairies. We may have an image in our mind of a small farm with a few cows that somebody milks and a few different crops and other animals. And those still exist, and there may be a number of those scattered around, but they don't produce most of the milk and dairy product that you find in the store. Those are produced on essentially animal factories that may have 1,000, 5,000, or 10,000 animals. And so the environmental impact in part stems from just how big they are. One cow has been bred now to produce an enormous amount of milk. And in producing an enormous amount of milk, they also produce an enormous amount of waste. One individual cow can produce as much waste as 200 or 300 humans. And so if you have 1,000 or 5,000 cows, that's a lot of manure in one place. And traditionally, most dairies will hold that manure in a big pit, and then they will spread it on the ground because ideally manure does have some good nutrients and can be used as fertilizer. But when you have this many animals crammed together, you often don't have enough land, and essentially more manure is put on the land than the plants can absorb, and a lot of that runs off into the water. And as you can imagine, vast amounts of manure in your water will lead to algae blooms. You've seen those, I'm sure, in Florida. We've seen them. I'm up in New York. You've seen them everywhere around the country and around the world. And that's largely because too many nutrients are in our water. And the major source of those nutrients is agriculture, and the biggest source of that are the animals. There's also air pollution from dairies, these large scale dairies that produce most of our product. And that's a couple different reasons. One goes back to that manure I was telling you about. We all know that manure sort of stinks, but manure also releases methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It releases nitrous oxide, which is another potent greenhouse gas.
I'd like to ask specifically about what Earthjustice is doing in this arena.
Sure. So, well, if I can, the air pollution is methane, nitrous oxide. It's also the of hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, which are poisonous gases. So it's very significant air pollution, both from a local community perspective and a climate perspective. And so Earthjustice, along with our allies, which can be both other national environmental groups and a lot of local community groups that are often largely comprised of people who live next door to or in the very near surroundings of these large animal factories. Uh, we're taking a number of approaches. The first is to try to ensure that EPA does its job. These are essentially factories at this point. They are not the little beautiful farm you have in your mind that might have been the case 50 years ago. And as factories, they should be regulated as factories. There should be air pollution and water pollution limits on these, just as there are in every other type of factories.
Is there not now?
By and large, there is not. There's really virtually no air pollution limits on them, and there's very few water pollution limits. So we have been, in various different ways, petitioning and litigating against EPA to try to get EPA to do its job and protect those who are, frankly, nearby, downwind and downstream, and the people who work at these operations. And that has been tough, but we're continuing and we're pushing hard. We also work at the state level because states can sometimes go beyond what EPA does. So if EPA is not, for example, requiring adequate water pollution protections, a state can do more. But politically, that's often tough. And so very few states have done much more than what the federal government requires. And so in a few states, we are pushing hard, and some states have done more than the federal government.
Is Florida one of them, Peter? Is Florida warm? Is Florida warm to that or no?
I don't know the specifics about Florida. I'm sorry. I know more about other states. Well, I won't speculate, but I don't think so. In any event, it is possible, though, to have a dairy that doesn't pollute, and that's the important part. Very often, people say, "Well, this is just the way it is," and I think what's important is that you can run a dairy. How you manage that manure that I was talking about can be managed in some ways that produce a lot of odor and a lot of greenhouse gas and a lot of ammonia, and it can be managed in ways that doesn't produce that type of air pollution. And that may be a little more complicated, it may be a little more expensive, but it's a lot safer and a lot cleaner and a lot better for the neighbors. And similarly, right now, we often these large dairies just really hold their waste, as I said, in these big pits and then put it on the fields, and that is devastating to nearby waters. And it doesn't have to be that way. So a lot of this is to make people understand, uh, policymakers and neighbors at every level, that we can produce the dairy product that people want, but in a much cleaner way.